No other car offers it, foreign or domestic, only Cadillac. It's the exclusive new V-8-6-4 fuel injection, a standard gasoline engine for all 1981 Cadillacs. As you start out, all 8 cylinders are in operation. As power needs lessen, the car automatically goes to 6 cylinders, and then to 4 cylinders. When you need it, it instantly reverts to 8 cylinders again. Test drive V-8-6-4. Only your Cadillac dealer has it.
1981 was generally a nondescript year in Cadillac history. The full-size vehicles for Cadillac had been redone for the 1977 model year and were refreshed for the 1980 model year, with little change for 1981 aside from some different texturing to the grills and other details. The Seville was also new for the 1980 model year. The Eldorado had been introduced in 1979, so those were effectively just carried over designs, again with slightly different detailing for 1981. However, there was one area where Cadillac made some significant changes for 1981 versus previous model years, and that was in the under-hood department with the introduction of the modular displacement V-8-6-4 Cadillac engine. Now, modular displacement engines are pretty common today and have been for about the last 15 to 20 years. They're also generally pretty reliable aside from some teething problems that the early ones had, particularly if individuals didn't change their oil on the right frequency. But while the technology is commonly used today by many different automakers, in 1981 it was completely novel technology to install in a mass production vehicle. Recall to this point that Cadillac had produced its own V8 for many years, and in 1968 had introduced the 472 cubic inch monster engine under hood in all Cadillacs for that model year. The 472 replaced an aging design whose largest displacement was 429 cubic inches. Before that, it was 390 cubic inches. But the 472 was introduced so that Cadillac could have something that would be able to grow in terms of displacement, if you can believe that 429 cubic inches was too small. Of course, back at the time, other competitors were introducing larger V8s, including Chrysler with its 440 and Lincoln with its 460. So Cadillac, of course, had to keep up, if not take things a step further. In 1970, that 472 cubic inch V8 would be increased to 500 cubic inches in the Eldorado only. The other Cadillacs would continue with a 472 cubic inch V8 until 1975. It was in 1975 the Cadillac would drop the 472 and all Cadillacs would have the 500 cubic inch V8 under hood. In 1976, there was a Cadillac that didn't have a Cadillac source V8 under hood. That was the 1976 Seville, which had an Oldsmobile source 350 cubic inch V8, but it was topped by a Bendix electronic fuel injection setup that was unique to Cadillac. It was one of the first Cadillacs in the vein of this downsizing theme that would continue for a number of years. And interestingly, the Seville was Cadillac's most expensive vehicle for 1976, despite the fact that it was its smallest production car. As the 70s wore on, General Motors and Cadillac division leadership knew that they were going to have to improve fuel economy. One of the things that had been introduced by this point was what was called Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standards, or CAFE standards, that mandated that U.S. automakers had to obtain a fleet fuel economy average across all of their vehicles sold of 27.5 miles per gallon by the mid-1980s. And this was at a time when the average American vehicle was getting somewhere around 13-ish miles per gallon, 14-ish miles per gallon on the highway. So imagine you really had to double the fuel economy of vehicles in what effectively amounted to a decade or less. That could mean one model generation or two model generations of cars. And as a result, GM and Cadillac leadership had to come up with some interesting ways to help improve the fuel economy. The first improvement came with just downsizing the overall vehicles in 1977, aside from the Seville. But the new for 1977 full-size cars were significantly smaller and lighter than the vehicles that they replaced. And of course, when you lose mass, you improve the fuel economy because the car has to push around a lot less weight. For 1977, as a result, Cadillac downsized its engine from 500 cubic inches to 425 cubic inches. And this did improve fuel economy for the 1977 models versus the 1976 models. I would say that on the freeway with my 1976 Cadillacs, I would be able to get about 14 miles per gallon at 70 miles an hour. And with one of the downsized Cadillacs I previously owned, I was able to get, I would say around 16-ish miles per gallon at 70 miles an hour, maybe a little bit better even, especially given that Cadillac was putting some pretty lazy rear end ratios in their cars during this time frame. Now, 16 and a half miles per gallon versus 14 miles per gallon doesn't sound like a heck of a lot, but that's about 20% better fuel economy. So saving 20% at the pump, I think a lot of people took that. And the 1977 Cadillacs were commercially very successful. However, one of the complaints about the Cadillacs for 1977 was that they didn't look as big and have as much presence as the Lincoln automobiles at the time, where Lincoln just simply didn't downsize because, number one, they didn't have the capital, but number two, and perhaps more importantly, Henry Ford, as well as the chief engineer of Lincoln, were just against downsizing their vehicles. And so while Cadillac had downsized their cars in 1977, Lincoln would take a few more years to follow suit. In 1980, Cadillac would revise the styling of its full-size cars and try to make them look visually longer, and did so by having a more vertical backlight on the car, which made the rear quarter panel look longer. It was effective, and those vehicles, again, were a success. But as a result of the increasing corporate average fuel economy standards, Cadillac introduced a 368 cubic inch V8 for the 1980 model year. There was effectively a downsized 425 cubic inch V8. Now, there was nothing wrong with this 368 cubic inch V8, aside from the fact that it was, well, let's say, significantly less powerful than the 425 cubic inch engine that it replaced. That 425 made around 180 horsepower and 325 pound-feet of torque in carbureted form. And this 368 cubic incher made just 150 horsepower and 265 pound-feet of torque. So it was significantly down on horsepower as well as torque. And that's not a great place to be in a 4,000-pound car. The other issue for 1980 was that Cadillac made the Oldsmobile Source 350 cubic inch diesel engine standard equipment in the 1980 Bustleback Seville. I think part of this was just to help with the corporate average fuel economy, but perhaps also to give the Seville something a bit unique when it was introduced in 1980. Unfortunately, unique is not always a desirable trait, and for those who have watched the channel before, they know the pitfalls of this Olds diesel, and they were myriad. Well, unfortunately, as time went on, for the 1981 model year, Cadillac would make another misstep and introduce its own modular displacement V8, the Cadillac V-8-6-4. Now, this V-8-6-4 was effectively a Cadillac 368 cubic inch engine, but it had solenoids on 4 of the cylinders that would deactivate the rocker arms so that they wouldn't move up and down when the car would change between one of 3 modes. The first mode, as you saw in the commercial, was the 8-cylinder mode where the engine just operated normally, and that was fine. The second mode was an intermediate 6-cylinder mode where 2 of the cylinders would be deactivated, and then the final mode was 4-cylinder mode where 4 cylinders would be deactivated. The thought was that you'd start out with 8-cylinder power, and then as power needs reduced, you could drop down to 6 cylinders and drop down to 4 cylinders and get better fuel economy in 4-cylinder mode than you would otherwise be able to obtain. It was a reasonable idea, I would say, but unfortunately in execution, it was very challenged. The first issue associated with the V-8-6-4 was that even when it was working properly, the six-cylinder mode was an imbalanced mode and the engine would shake around a decent amount. And once you got to four-cylinder mode, I would say the cylinder deactivation was more seamless, if you can call it seamless, but it was smoother than the six-cylinder mode. The engine was just more inherently balanced in this mode. And I suspect this is one reason why on V8s today with cylinder deactivation, they just go from eight-cylinder mode to four-cylinder mode. They don't step down to a six-cylinder mode and then a four-cylinder mode. Now, the other issue here was that Cadillac was trying to execute cylinder deactivation without multi-point fuel injection. The V-8-6-4 just had what Cadillac called digital fuel injection, effectively a throttle body setup with two injectors for the car with a wet intake manifold. So this was not a multi-port setup where there was an injector per cylinder like there is in modern days. And that makes it easier as well as smoother and more efficient when activating cylinder deactivation, because you can just cut the fuel to those cylinders to help in the cylinder deactivation process versus having a wet intake manifold and potentially having some fuel air charge that is just kind of pooling in that area where the rocker arms have been shut off and the valves are not moving up and down, as was the case on the V-8-6-4. The next issue associated with the V-8-6-4 is that it used a lot of primitive electronics to activate the setup, including a ECM that in some cases would crap out and be, let's call it, relatively fragile. For those who are fans of the Vice Grip Garage channel, you will note that Derek tried to fix up a 1981 Cadillac and he just couldn't fix it, perhaps because of a significant ECM issue with the car that he had. And on top of somewhat fragile ECMs, the solenoids that would deactivate the valve train on the deactivating cylinders were also not overly reliable. So the car sometimes would get stuck in six-cylinder mode or four-cylinder mode. You can imagine that wouldn't be a great thing, especially if you're trying to take off from a stoplight, to have a V4 in place of a V8 in a 4,000-pound-ish car. The other issue was that, as I mentioned, the electronics and the technology at the time really just wasn't set up for cylinder deactivation, from the digital fuel injection that Cadillac employed as opposed to the multi-port fuel injection, to the fact that these cars don't have electronic throttle control. It's a cable throttle control, and all cars with modern cylinder deactivation have electronic throttle control. And the reason for that is that when you deactivate four cylinders, let's say on an eight-cylinder to go into four-cylinder mode, one of the things that happens, in addition to just the cylinders deactivating, is that the throttle plate can vary and tends to open up in four-cylinder mode, so you have a more open throttle in four-cylinder mode than you would in eight-cylinder mode, and that reduces throttling losses in the engine. So that's another benefit. You get more efficiency, and it also helps smooth the transition from four to eight-cylinder mode because the ECM can effectively move the throttle plate to compensate for the changes in the modes between four and eight-cylinder mode. That was just technology that was not available on the V-8-6-4. The V-8-6-4 did have electronic throttle control, but that was really to be used upon startup and for idle speed control, or when the air conditioning compressor kicked on, it would increase the idle speed a little bit. This was not something where the throttle plates would open up when four-cylinder mode was activated. Although I suppose perhaps Cadillac could have even executed that, but I don't think that they understood well how to do that at the time. In any event, the V-8-6-4, while great in overall theory, was just an absolute blunder in practice. Cadillac customers hated it. It had a number of issues that I mentioned, and oftentimes Cadillac buyers would be returning their cars to the dealer to fix these engines. And as you saw from the commercial, the engine was standard across the lineup on 1981 Cadillacs, except the Seville, where the Olds diesel remained standard for 1981. But the setup was so low that Cadillac basically chucked it to the side for 1982 and unfortunately introduced another stinker of an engine across the lineup, and that was the Cadillac HT4100 4.1 liter V8. So during this period, it just wasn't great to be a Cadillac buyer. And if you wanted to do something to kill a car division off, there's little more that you can do than introducing a series of unreliable engines under hood. In fact, I would say the most reliable engine under hood during these years for Cadillac was the credit option 4.1 liter Buick V6, which effectively is a larger version of the Buick 3.8 that we all know and love. I will say that the 4.1 or even the Buick 3.8 during this time frame was not the same as the 3800 engine that would be introduced in 1988 that would have a balance shaft and staggered cylinder banks. This engine was not quite as good, but when you had to pick between the Olds diesel, the Cadillac V-8-6-4, and the Buick V6, the Buick V6 was actually the one to pick for overall reliability. The only car that would keep the V-8-6-4 for 1982 was the limousine Cadillac, and presumably that's because the 4.1 liter V8 just couldn't push around a 4,500 pound limousine, especially with just around 135 horsepower under hood. It wasn't going anywhere very fast. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on the Cadillac V-8-6-4. Thanks again for watching.